Hey, my name is Caleb Render. I'm 37 years old and I live alone at the end of a dirt road called Hollow Pine, just outside Marfa, Texas, where the land runs flat and gold to the edge of the sky and the wind never quite stops talking. It isn't much by anybody's measure. 22 acres of hard pasture, a barn that leans a little more every winter, a stock tank that holds water if you don't ask too much of it, and a string of horses nobody else wanted, a swayback gelding, a half-blind mare, 2 Mustangs the auction couldn't move. People around here call the place the Render spread out of habit, though my father has been 4 years in the ground and there's no son worth the name to carry it. I'm the son. I run a failing horse farm at the bottom of a road most folks have no reason to drive down, and I have made my peace with the quiet the way a man makes peace with a wound that never fully closes. There was a time I was easier to look at, easier to be around. Before the accident, before the fire that took the east stable and the colt I couldn't pull out in time, before the burn scar climbed up the inside of my right forearm and folks in town started finding the floor more interesting than my face. I don't blame them. A man learns to read what people won't say. I read it in the way the feed clerk counts my change without meeting my eyes, in the way mothers steer their children a half-step wider when I pass on the boardwalk. So I stopped going into Marfa more than I had to. I haul feed on Tuesdays, I sell what I can, and I come home to the horses, who don't care about the scar or the silence or the fact that the bank is closing on me like weather. Because that was the truth of it, the thing I carried into that particular evening like a stone in my boot. 6 weeks back, a letter had come from the Presidio County Bank with a date typed on it in a font that didn't care about anything. The balloon payment on the farm note, $11,000 my father had borrowed to keep the place breathing through a bad drought, was due in full on the last Friday of the month. Pay it, or the land went to auction, and the last Friday of the month was 19 days out, and I had $430 in a coffee can and a string of horses nobody wanted. I had stopped praying about it. The earth doesn't judge a man's face, my father used to say, standing at this same fence rail with his hat pushed back, but the bank surely does. He was a hard man and a fair one, and the last thing he ever told me, lying small and gray in that hospital bed, was, "Look after the place, Caleb, and if somebody ever comes to that door needing help, you help them, even when it costs you. That's the only kind of rich a man like us ever gets to be." I had nodded and meant it, the way you mean things you don't yet understand. I didn't understand it until the night she came up my road. It was an evening in late October, the light going copper and then violet across the pasture, the kind of dusk that makes the whole flat country look like it's holding its breath. I was at the fence dropping a flake of hay over the rail for the half-blind mare when I saw the dust first. A low rooster tail of caliche coming up Hollow Pine. Fast, too fast for a road that goes nowhere but here. A truck I didn't know, older, a fender the wrong color, and it slowed hard at my gate like the driver wasn't sure she'd reached the end of something or the start of it. She got out before the engine had fully died. A young woman, maybe 28, in a thin blue dress that didn't belong to a dirt road, with a canvas bag clutched to her chest and her hair coming loose from whatever pins had held it that morning. She had the look I knew from the inside, the look of somebody who has been running long enough that stopping feels more dangerous than moving. Her eyes went to my scar and then, deliberately, did not flinch away from it, and that small thing, that refusal to look away, was the first thing that ever made my chest tighten over a stranger. "Are you the man who owns this land?" she asked, and her voice was steady but worn thin, the way a rope is steady right before it isn't. I said I was. I said it carefully, the way you talk to a spooked animal, not because I thought she'd run, but because I could see how close to the edge she was standing. She looked back down my road the way she come, like the dust still hanging in the air was something that might catch up to her. Then she looked at me again, and she lifted her chin, and she said the words I will hear at the back of my skull for the rest of my life. "I need a husband before sundown," she said, "a real one, on paper, today." I didn't laugh. I want that on the record because a lot of men would have, and a few weeks earlier maybe I'd have at least let my mouth do something foolish. But there was nothing funny in her face. There was only fear, held down hard under a layer of will, and underneath that, somewhere I could barely see, the kind of hope a person hates themselves for still having. The sun was a hand's width above the rim of the world. Sundown was real and close. I set the hay hook down on the fence rail, and I looked at her, this stranger in a blue dress at the end of my nowhere road, and the only thing I asked her was the only thing that mattered. "What are you running from?" I said. Something went out of her then, some held breath, like she'd braced for a different question, for "Who are you?" or "What's in it for me?" or "Are you crazy?" And instead, I'd asked the one that let her be a person instead of a problem. "My family," she said. "If you marry me by midnight, there's nothing they can do. There's a clause, I'll explain it, but not out here. Please." And maybe a wiser man would have asked for the whole of it before he moved, but my father's voice was in my ear, and the light was failing, and I have never in my life been able to turn away from someone bracing to be turned away. "All right," I said, "come up to the house. You can tell me on the way to the courthouse." Her name was Della Hartwell, and over a cup of coffee she could barely hold without it shaking, she told me enough. She came from money, old, dry, West Texas money, cattle and land, and a name that opened doors in 3 counties. Her grandfather had built a fortune, and before he died built something else, a trust that would pass to Della free and clear on the condition that she be lawfully married by her 29th birthday and to a man of her own choosing, not the family's. He'd done it, she said, because he'd watched her father marry his children off like he was trading steers, and he wanted at least one of them to choose. Her birthday was tomorrow, and her uncle, a man named Royce Hartwell, who ran the family holdings now and meant to keep running them, had already chosen a husband for her, a business partner of his, a smiling man with cold hands who saw Della as a clause in a contract, a way to fold her grandfather's trust back into the family accounts. She'd packed a bag and driven east until the road ran out, which was how the road ran out at my gate. "I'm not asking you to love me," she said, and her voice was flat with shame. "I'm not asking you to pretend to. I have a little money. I can pay you. You'd be doing me a kindness and getting something for it, that's all." I looked at the coffee can on the shelf with its $400 and the bank letter folded under it, and for one ugly second the math of my own ruin whispered at me. Then I looked at her face. "I don't want your money," I said. "Keep it. You'll need it." We were married that night by a justice of the peace in Presidio who'd known my father and asked no questions a man could refuse to answer, with the courthouse janitor and a woman from the county clerk's office standing as our witnesses. And it was the strangest, plainest hour of my life when the justice said the words and Della said, "I do," In a whisper, she was looking at the floor. When he said them to me, I looked at her, and I said, I do, clear, because if I was going to do a thing, I was going to do it like I meant it. And some part of me, even then, did. We drove home under a sky thick with stars, the kind of stars you only get out here where there's no town to drown them, and neither of us said much. At the house, I made up the back bedroom, the one that had been my mother's sewing room with clean sheets and the good quilt, and I showed her the lock on the door. It works, I told her. You can throw it. I sleep down the hall, and I won't ever try it. You have my word, and out here a man's word is about all he's got, so I don't spend it cheap. She stood in the doorway holding her canvas bag and looked at me for a long moment. This scarred stranger she'd married 4 hours ago. "Why are you being kind to me?" she asked. And there was suspicion in it, but under the suspicion was exhaustion, and under that, again, the thing she hated herself for hoping. "Because somebody asked my father once," I said, "and he didn't turn them away. And because you didn't look away from my arm." She didn't have an answer for that. She went in, and after a while I heard the lock turn, and I stood in the dark hall a moment, listening to a sound that meant a stranger felt safe enough to sleep under my roof. And I went to bed feeling, for the first time in 4 years, like the house was not entirely empty. The first days were careful as walking on river ice. She kept to herself, learned the rhythms of the place from a distance, the way I fed at dawn and again at dusk, the way the half-blind mare followed my voice, the way I'd talk low to the mustangs until they let me near. On the 3rd morning, I came in from chores, and the kitchen smelled like something other than burnt coffee for the first time in years. She'd found the flour and the lard and made biscuits, and she set a plate down in front of me without a word and watched, almost afraid, to see if I'd take it as charity or insult. I took it as the kindest thing anybody had done for me in longer than I could count, and I told her so with my mouth full, and she laughed, a startled rusty sound like a hinge that hadn't turned in a long time, and something between us loosened a notch. After that we found a rhythm. She could ride, it turned out, better than I'd have guessed from the blue dress, and she started coming out to the corral in the mornings, and the half-blind mare took to her the way that mare took to almost nobody. We weeded the kitchen garden that had gone to ruin and got a few late rows of greens in. I fixed the cabinet hinge in the kitchen that had hung crooked since my mother's time, and Della stood and watched me do it and said, "You're good with your hands." And I felt the back of my neck go warm like I was 16. One evening, she put a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, just blue bonnets gone to seed and some yellow stuff from the ditch, and the next morning the light came through it onto the table, and I sat there longer than I needed to, looking at it, because it was the kind of small thing a home has and a house doesn't. Little by little, the house started to feel like one. She found my mother's recipe box in a drawer nobody had opened since the funeral and learned to make the cornbread my mother used to make. And the first time she set it on the table, I had to step out onto the porch a minute before I could come back and eat it, and Della didn't ask why. She just kept my plate warm. I mended the porch swing that had hung from one chain since I was a boy, and we took to sitting out on it in the cool of the evening, watching the light go down over the pasture, not always talking, and I came to learn that there is a particular kind of quiet that two people make together that is the exact opposite of the quiet a man makes alone, One is a wound, and the other is a kind of company. She started keeping a list on the back of an envelope of things the place needed, and instead of feeling like one more accounting of my failures, it felt somehow like a future being written item by small item. A latch for the chicken run, lime for the garden, a warmer coat for her before the real cold came, which meant she was planning to be there when the real cold came. And I held on to that thought like a coal in a cold hand. We traded our griefs slow, the way you pay out a rope so it doesn't burn your hands. Her mother had died when she was 9, and the family had handled her grief like a scheduling problem. My mother had passed the winter before the fire, and my father a few years after, and I told her about the fire one night on the porch because she asked about the scar straight out, not sideways the way most people did. I told her about the cold, about going back in twice and not being able to go back a third time, about the way the town had quietly decided I was a thing to be sorry for. And when I finished, she didn't say, "It wasn't your fault," the way people do to fill the silence. She reached over and she put her hand flat against the burn on my forearm, over the worst of it, and she held it there. "I don't see a monster," she said. "I see a man who ran into a fire for something that couldn't even thank him. I see a good man who got hurt and decided to hide it." Nobody had touched that arm on purpose in 4 years. I had to look out at the dark pasture for a while before I could trust my voice, and when I could, all I said was, "It's late." But I didn't move, and neither did she, and her hand stayed where it was a good while longer. I won't pretend I didn't know by then what was happening to me. A man my age, alone as long as I'd been alone, doesn't mistake the feeling when it comes. I just didn't think I had any right to it. She'd come to me running, and I'd given my word, and I wasn't going to be one more man who wanted something from her she hadn't offered. So I kept it to myself, and I let the days do what days do, and I figured the trust would clear on her birthday, and she'd take her freedom and her grandfather's money and her own life and drive back out my road someday, and I'd have the memory of a few good weeks to keep me warm through the next stretch of quiet. That was the plan I made. That was the plan that lasted right up until the morning a black car came up Hollow Pine that didn't slow uncertain at the gate the way Della's truck had. It came up like it owned the road, and the man who got out of it was Royce Hartwell. I knew him before she said his name. Some men carry their money in their shoulders, and he was one of them. Pressed clothes on a working ranch, a watch worth more than my horses, a smile that had been practiced in a mirror until it didn't need the man behind it anymore. He had a lawyer with him, a soft, sweating fellow with a briefcase, and he stood in my yard and looked at my leaning barn and my unwanted horses like he was pricing it all for scrap. "So, you're the husband," Royce said, and the word came out of him like something he'd scraped off his boot. "I have to admire it, Della. When you decide to be vulgar, you really commit." Della had come out onto the porch behind me, and I felt her go rigid. "You can't undo it, Royce," she said. "It's done. It's legal. The trust is mine on my birthday, and there's nothing—" "Oh, the marriage is real," Royce said, smiling wider. "I'm sure it is. I'm sure this gentleman performed it beautifully. But here's the thing about grandfather's trust, sweetheart, and I'd have explained this if you'd answered your phone. A marriage entered into to defraud the conditions of a trust isn't a marriage at all in the eyes of the law. It's a sham. And a sham can be set aside." He nodded at the sweating lawyer, who stepped forward and held out a thick envelope to me like it was a gift. "We've filed in district court in Presidio," the lawyer said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "A petition to declare the marriage void as a fraud upon the trust and a related action. Your wife transferred a parcel of family land into a joint deed with you 3 days ago, Mr. Render. The family contends that transfer was made under undue influence and constitutes a cloud on title that we're moving to quiet. There's also—" He hesitated, and Royce's smile didn't move. "A complaint that's been forwarded to the county regarding the welfare of the animals on this property. An anonymous tip. The hearing on all of it is set for the 28th. The 28th, the last Friday of the month, the same day my farm note came due. I understood then, standing in my own yard with that envelope in my hand, that this man had looked into my life the way you'd look into a poor man's wallet, found the bank date, and chosen it on purpose so that on the day I might lose the land for $11,000, I would also be in a courtroom fighting to keep my wife from being declared a fraud. He wanted me broke and rattled and easy to step over. Della and I will be reasonable people," Royce said, walking back toward his car. "Sign a quiet annulment, hand back the deed, and I'll see the bank gets handled. You keep your dirt and your scars, Mr. Render, and we all forget this unpleasantness. Or you fight the Hartwells in a courtroom with a coffee can full of money and lose everything, including her. Think about which kind of man you want to be." He drove off and left the dust hanging, and Della sat down hard on the porch step and put her face in her hands, and I stood there a long time before I could make myself sit down beside her. "I've ruined you," she said into her palms. "He'll take the farm. He'll say I tricked you, that you only married me for the land, and he has lawyers and judges he plays golf with, and I have brought all of it down on the one person who was decent to me. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to do exactly what Royce wanted. I knew it. Sign the paper, hand back the deed, let him pay the bank, keep my land and my quiet, and lose nothing but a woman I had no right to in the first place. I sat there, and I did the math of it one more time. And then I reached over, and I lifted her chin the way she'd lifted her own that first evening, so she had to look at me. "Della," I said, "I have to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide anything, because I don't want it weighing on the wrong side of your scale. I didn't marry you for the land. I married you because you needed a husband before sundown, and I had it in me to be one. And somewhere in these few weeks, weeding that garden and fixing that hinge and watching you with that blind mare, I stopped pretending to myself. I've fallen in love with my wife. There, it said. So I'm not signing his paper, not because of the trust and not because of the land, because I made a vow in that courthouse, and a render keeps his word even when it costs him, especially when it costs him. We're going to that hearing, and we're going to win." She stared at me, and her eyes filled, and for a second I thought I'd said too much and frightened her off. Then she said, in a whisper, "You'd lose the farm for me." "I'd lose more than that," I said, "but I don't think I'm going to have to." That night I started making calls, and I learned a thing about a small county that men like Royce Hartwell forget. A poor man who has lived in a place all his life and never cheated anybody has a kind of credit that doesn't show up in a bank. The justice of the peace who'd married us remembered my father and was willing to swear under oath that our marriage had been performed in good faith with no coaching, with Della's free consent. The woman from the county clerk's office, who'd witnessed it, said she'd never seen two people stand up plainer or quieter. The county agent who came out about the anonymous tip on the animals spent an afternoon walking my pasture and left shaking his head. And he wrote in his report that every animal on the render place was sound, fed, and watered, and that several were rescues a crueler man would have shot. And then there was Della's grandfather, because Della, going through the canvas bag she'd packed in such a hurry, found among her things a folder of her grandfather's papers she'd grabbed without thinking, and in that folder were letters. The old man's own handwriting, year after year, laying out in plain words exactly why he'd built the trust the way he had. "I have watched my son sell his children like cattle," one letter said, "and I will not die letting it happen to the last good one. Della is to choose her own man, and I do not care if he is rich or poor, whole or broken, so long as he is kind to her, because kindness is the only inheritance that ever mattered in this family and the only one we have run short of. We took all of it to a lawyer in Marfa, a tired, honest woman named Inez Caldwell, who did wills and water rights and didn't golf with anybody. And when she read those letters, her eyebrows went up, and she said, 'Mr. Render, Mrs. Render, your uncle has made a serious mistake. He's accused you of fraud. But fraud is a thing you have to prove, and the man who wrote these letters built that trust precisely to protect a marriage exactly like yours. I think we should let him try.'" The hearing was on the 28th, in the old district courtroom in Presidio, under a slow-ceiling fan and a row of high windows that let the West Texas light fall in long bars across the floor. Royce came in with 3 lawyers and that practiced smile, and he had brought the smiling, cold-handed man he'd meant Della to marry, and they sat at their table looking like a bank. We sat at ours with Inez Caldwell and a cardboard box of letters and witnesses on a bench behind us, the justice of the peace, the clerk, the county agent, and when I turned around, 4 or 5 folks from town I hadn't expected, the feed clerk who never met my eyes, a rancher whose mares I doctored for free in a bad foaling year, people who, it turned out, had been keeping a quieter account of me than I'd known. Royce's lead lawyer went first, and he was good, smooth, and grave, painting a picture of a desperate spinster heiress and a scarred opportunist who'd seen a fortune drive up his road and grabbed it, a marriage, cooked up in an afternoon to steal a family's land. He held up the joint deed, he mentioned my bank debt and the $11,000 and let the number hang in the air like proof. "This man," he said, pointing at me without looking at me, "was 19 days from losing everything when he happened to marry an heiress. The court can draw its own conclusions about the romance involved." I felt my face heat. Beside me, Della's hand found mine under the table and held on. Then Inez Caldwell stood up, and she didn't raise her voice once. She called the justice of the peace, who told the court plainly that no one had coached us, that Della had given her consent freely and clearly, that he'd married 100 couples, and ours was as real as any. She called the county agent, who read his report on the animals into the record, and the anonymous welfare complaint died right there, with everyone in the room understanding who had made it and why. And then she did the thing Royce never saw coming, because men like Royce never read the documents they think they own. She entered the grandfather's letters into evidence, and she read them aloud, one after another, in that quiet, hot courtroom. The old man's own words about his son selling his children like cattle, about wanting Della to choose rich or poor, whole or broken, so long as he was kind. And then Inez turned to Royce, still seated and no longer smiling, and she said, "Your Honor, the petitioner claims this marriage is a fraud upon the trust, but the man who created the trust wrote in his own hand that he built it to make exactly this marriage possible. The only fraud before this court is the petitioner's, Mr. Royce Hartwell, who has tried to use his late father's instrument to do the precise thing his father designed it to prevent. We'd further note for the record that this is not the first time we've pulled filings from 2 other counties." And she held up another sheaf of paper, and the soft, sweating lawyer beside Royce went the color of ash, because Inez had found it, a pattern. 2 earlier cases where Royce had moved to set aside a relative's inheritance on manufactured grounds, one of them quietly settled, one of them dismissed for cause. The courtroom, which had been still, got stiller. The judge, a lean old man named Pruitt, who had said almost nothing the whole morning, took off his glasses and looked at Royce Hartwell for a long, long moment. "Mr. Hartwell," he said finally, "I've sat on this bench 31 years, and I have learned to tell the difference between a man protecting his family and a man feeding on it. The marriage of Caleb and Della Render is valid in every particular and is so recognized by this court. The petition to declare it void is denied. The action to quiet title on the deed is denied. The transfer was made freely between spouses and stands. As for the pattern of filings counsel has brought to my attention, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for review, and I'd advise you to retain a different sort of lawyer than the kind you brought today." He set his glasses back on. "That transaction is declared sound. These 2 are married. We're adjourned." For a second nobody moved. Then the bench behind me made a low sound, the feed clerk and the rancher and the others, not a cheer exactly. This isn't a place that cheers, but something, a release of breath, a shifting, the sound of a town quietly changing its mind about a man. Royce Hartwell stood up, and the smile was finally gone, and he had nothing to say. He gathered his lawyers and his cold-handed business partner, and he walked out of that courtroom into the white light, and the room turned its back on him as he went. And he was, for the first time in his life, I'd guess, a poor man in every way that counts. Outside on the courthouse steps, Della stood blinking in the sun with the box of her grandfather's letters in her arms, and the feed clerk came up, the one who'd never met my eyes, and he stuck out his hand, and he said, "Caleb, well, your daddy'd be proud of how you stood up in there. We should have come around sooner." And I shook his hand, and I said the only thing I had, which was, anybody would have stood up. She's worth standing up for. But the farm note was still due that day, and even winning a courtroom doesn't make $11,000 appear in a coffee can. We drove back to Marfa to the bank to ask Mr. Pruitt's nephew, who ran it, for 2 more weeks, ready to beg. And we found out that the trust, Della's trust, free and clear now on her 29th birthday, recognized by the court not 3 hours old, had cleared into an account that morning. She could have paid the note 10 times over and bought herself a far nicer life than a leaning barn at the end of a dirt road. She stood in the bank with the papers in her hand, and she looked at me, and I made myself say it, because a man has to give a person the door even when he's praying they don't take it. "You're free now, Della," I said, "truly free. The trust is yours. The family's beaten, and you don't owe me a thing. I meant the vow, but I won't hold you to a marriage you made to a stranger to save your skin. If you want to take your money and your life and go, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me, and I'll think well of you every day of mine." She was quiet a moment. Then she set the bank papers down on the counter, and she took my scarred right hand in both of hers, right there in front of God and the teller and the whole of Presidio County, and she pressed her thumb over the burn the way she had that night on the porch. "Caleb Brenda," she said, "I drove to the end of every road I had looking for a way out, and I found the only road I ever want to be on. I'm not free of you. I don't want to be. Pay the note. It's our farm." And then she paid the note herself and laughed at me when I tried to argue about it, and we drove home up Hollow Pine in the gold evening light, married twice over now, once on paper to save her, and once for real, somewhere between a crooked hinge and a jar of ditch flowers and a courtroom full of letters from a dead man who'd understood, before either of us did, that kindness was the only fortune worth leaving behind. A year after the night she came to my door, the farm was a different place, and so was I. The trust didn't make us idle. It made us able. We rebuilt the east stable that had burned, and this time it went up square and strong, and we filled it not with unwanted horses we couldn't save, but with rescues we could. Della had a head for it, and word got around, and the render place became known in 3 counties as the spread that took the horses nobody else would, and made something of them, the way somebody had once made something of the 2 of us. The town came up our road now without being asked. The feed clerk's kids learned to ride on our gentlest mare. Inez Caldwell came to Sunday dinner most weeks and argued politics with whoever showed. Royce Hartwell, I heard, had his troubles with the district attorney and lost a good deal of what he'd spent his life clutching. I won't say I was sorry, but I found I didn't think about him much, which is its own kind of winning. And on a porch step one evening in October, almost exactly a year on, with the light going copper and then violet across the pasture the way it had that first night, Della took my hand and put it flat against herself, just below her ribs, and she said, "Caleb, we're going to have a baby." And I sat there at the end of my nowhere road that was not nowhere anymore, scarred and married and richer than I had ever once believed a man like me could be. And I thought about my father at this same fence rail telling me to help whoever came to the door even when it cost me. And I understood at last what he'd known and I hadn't, that the cost was never the point, that the cost was the whole of the gift. I had thought for 4 quiet years that my life would only ever be soil and seasons, old scars and silent rooms. But a frightened stranger had come up my road needing a husband before sundown, and I had asked her only what she was running from, and from that one question I had been given everything. Kindness doesn't always pay you back, and when it does, it never pays you back in the coin you expected. But you stop anyway. You open the door anyway, because the open door is the only thing a poor man owns that a rich man can never take. And some night, if you've kept it open, the rest of your life will walk through it in a thin blue dress and ask you for the one thing you have left to give.